Dr. Meg Jay. Welcome to the Development by David podcast. My new friend, I can't believe I'm saying this. Welcome.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here. It's a real privilege, actually. I'm very inspired by your story and what you're doing. And so I wouldn't miss it.
Oh, Meg. Have you done a Scottish podcast before by any chance?
I don't, I hate to say no because I've been doing this for a few years now, but don't think so. I'm sure I've done some in the UK or, in Britain, but. Um,
That's me just trying to add to my identity capital. I'm trying to get a claim to fame here, Meg. That's what
okay.
it is.
You're my first Scottish podcast. How about that? You're my very first Scottish podcast.
That's going in the bio. That's going in the
Yeah.
bio, Meg.
I'm sure you have way cooler things than that, but thank you.
I feel somewhat embarrassed to call myself a developmental podcast when I owe a lot of my own personal development to you and your book, your talks, and they circle around the kind of decade that I'm currently existing in or embarking on, and I've not only rationalized my 20s but post rationalized my early 20s, and I've learned so much about myself that I'm undoubtedly grateful for that I'll carry on to my 30s. And I just want to say off the bat, thank you for giving me this resource. Thank you for not even knowing I exist but having such an impact on my life and so many people over the last 10 years since I guess you released this book.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that. I mean, that's really why I wrote The Defining Decade, was that I'm well aware that the percentage of people who can get in to see a therapist like myself, it's a very tiny percentage of the population. And as someone who grew up also like you, not being someone who could have afforded therapy, that really bothers me. And so a lot of my work has been about getting conversations out behind closed doors so that anybody with, a library card or $15 or 15 pounds could get the same information that other people or some other people are getting.
Thank you so much for your generosity, Meg. For the listeners who haven't seen me burst with excitement to host you on the podcast through my Instagram stories or tweets or whatever else I've been posting over the last few weeks or months, can you give a brief introduction to who Meg Jay is today in 2023?
Me, who I am? Okay, let's see. I'm a clinical psychologist, but honestly, I'm a teacher at heart in a lot of ways, and I think that goes back to why I write books and go on podcasts. Is that I really believe that most young adults don't need a therapist. They're not sick. They're not broken. They're, like you're saying on your podcast, they're developing. That things are changing. There's a lot in transition. There's a lot that they're uncertain about. And so a lot of my work is about getting information out there, really kind of teaching and educating to help people get through their 20s in a way that feels good for them, that's aligned with what they want. So, in short, I'm a clinical psychologist who specializes in 20 somethings. Some people say, why would you do that? My answer to that is, why would you not do that? It's the decade where probably more happens than any other decade in terms of change and development. So to me, that's where all the action is.
Before we get into some of that action, I wanted to keep the pulse on you. This podcast always follows the same kind of vein of using origin stories as a
Okay.
self-development
All
tool.
right. Go for it. Okay.
Well, I thought I would. You've had the pleasure to outlay so many journeys of your patients under pseudonyms in your book. And I've never really heard your story actually with all the podcasts that I've tuned into
Oh, no.
about your work. So can you
Yeah.
talk about 20-something-year-old Meg Jay?
Sure. I talk a little bit about it. I guess I talk about what I did after college in my 20s, but 20 something Meg Jay, I was fortunate enough to go to college. But did you go to college, David? Did you go?
N-
No.
No, I did. I
Okay.
went into employment straight from school.
Okay, okay. I did go to college, but I was definitely a scholarship, financial aid kid. Often, like you said, you felt about when you went into consulting. I had that feeling of, this place isn't for me, which I think it's too bad that I felt that way, because there are so many kids on college campuses that are there because of financial aid and scholarship. But I was a smart college kid who was fortunate enough to get scholarships and financial aid and get myself to some good universities. Somewhere in college, I figured out that psychology was for me. I think I kind of did college, they say, the way you're, quote, supposed to, as I took a whole bunch of different classes, had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And then one day it sort of dawned on me that I was making A's in all my psychology classes and I couldn't wait to go to them. And I did all the reading, even though I didn't have to. And then I realized, oh, well, duh, maybe I should do something like that with my life. Plus, it's very meaningful work, which appealed to me from the get-go. Right after college, though, I worked as an Outward Bound instructor. Do you know what that is? Outward Bound actually started in the UK like many, many, many years ago. But do you know what that is?
Is it a charity for?
It's a nonprofit, but it's an outdoor education organization. It's all over the world. It started in the UK, but they take special populations, people of all ages, on sort of outdoor educational adventure programs. So I spent the first few years of my 20s after college taking educated youth and Vietnam vets and survivors of violence and all different kind of special populations on, mountaineering or river or rock climbing trips. And that's what I did, which was great identity capital, to use a term that I, kind of make known for people in the defining decade. It even though it didn't seem like the most ambitious thing I could have done right out of college, it was really good for me. And then it helped me sort of develop my own leadership and kind of problem solving skills. And then it gave me a lot of identity capital when I went to go back to grad school for psychology. About 5 years later, it just made me more interesting than I might have been otherwise. So then I went back to grad school for clinical psych. I went to Berkeley, did that. And then now you're in my 30s by the time I was done with that. So my 20s were really a lot about education. I was learning, I was working, I was just getting tons of life experience. And, I talk about in the book, sort of your learning curve in your 20s is your earning curve in your 30s and beyond. And I don't just mean money, like in terms of, what you learn in your 20s really sets you up to have earned, whether it's money in your 30s and beyond, but also just privileges and flexibility and sort of your ability to kind of write your own ticket in the years to come. So my 20s were about like getting all the experiences that I could. Many of them work related, but some, like with Outward Bound, I figured out how to have cool work and personal experiences.
And you had fun too, right?
I had lots of fun. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes it's so funny. 20-somethings can be such black or white thinkers. So people will say, should I have fun in my 20s and then start my life? Or should I start my life and have fun when I retire? And I'm like, what? I don't understand this. So you should probably find a way where sort of work and love and play and all the things go together, in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year, that's kind of, I did have lots of fun in my 20s, also worked super hard too, which is, I think, put me in a position to continue to have fun in my 30s and 40s and 50s, because I'm, in a good position professionally. So I'm able to sort of do things that I want to do and that I like to do, not just think about, just a paycheck.
I love that, Megan. And I love the term you used, or the phrase you used, about your 20s being a learning curve and your 30s and later life being an earning curve. And just to kind of showcase or kind of put a spotlight on this podcast, like I'm at a net loss doing this podcast in terms of time,
Right. Mm-hmm. I'm sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Investment into technology, everything else. But I know in my 30s I'll have made so many great connections, built a platform, a reputation, identity capital, social capital, culture capital because of it.
Right.
And when times get tough on it, when I'm doing late night edits or booking guests on late night,
yeah,
I know it'll pay off eventually. I know my 30s will thank me for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely true. I think, the podcast is really cool and I'm glad you're doing it. And when you reached out to me, to be on the, I mean, I get a lot of podcast requests actually, and I can't do all of them, but there was definitely something about yours in terms of the focus on development and sort of your story around wanting the information to get out to people who maybe didn't grow up with parents who could have sort of shown them the way. That really spoke to me. So I'm really impressed that you're doing it. I'm glad you are.
Thank you, Meg. Before we go back into the defining decade, I want to just ask one more question around you and your story. Given that you went down such a nuanced, technical, admired role in psychology, and you talk about the kind of background that you came from, perhaps not having role models in your immediate family in this space, how did a career in psychology become visible to you?
It was through professors, that I thought and that was where I sort of learned to listen to myself. And, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to college, but also took college really seriously. I worked really, really hard, and I did really well, and I got to know my professors. And I work at University of Virginia. Not everybody does that. So really kind of investing in college paid off for me. But I got to know different professors, and I saw people, and I maybe like yourself, that I saw them and I thought, oh, that's a life that I would like. That's something that I could see myself doing. And then a similar thing happened in graduate school, where I looked at the different sort of psychologists that I was exposed to in graduate school. At Berkeley, many of them are researchers, and I pretty quickly decided that wasn't the route for me, being sort of tenure track research professor. But I also had clinical supervisors who were teaching me how to do sort of the therapy work. And I saw what their lives were like and what they were like, and that just felt like more of a fit for me. So it's like what you said, just, if you see it, you think like, well, maybe I could be that. Now, actually, maybe an even better example of that was actually writing the defining decade. Obviously, I never knew anyone who had written a book. I grew up, people asked me, like, did you want to be a writer when you were young? And I definitely did. I was always into writing. When I was a kid, I was a good writer. I would win these little local writing contests. And then when I was in college, I would get A's on my papers, and my professors would say, you should be published. But that's it, right? And that was kind of a not so great example of where they didn't help me, or I didn't ask, like, well, what does that mean? How would you ever do that? Like, that was an example, maybe like you, David, where I felt like, what? People like me don't do things like that. I don't know what that is. I don't know how you would ever go about doing that. I never ever thought about being a writer as a career. It just didn't seem practical enough, and I knew I had to pay the bills. Plus, I'm a nonfiction writer. Always have been. Like, I'm not a fantasy novelist kind of gal. So I think I knew, like, I needed to go live a life and have something to write about. But anyway, I was in graduate school, and a colleague, just another graduate student who was a couple of years ahead of me, wrote a popular press book, like a book that comes at the bookstore that that you could get on Amazon now. They didn't have Amazon then. And I thought, well, shoot, she did it. Maybe I could do that. And she was really the first person I'd ever seen that was anywhere adjacent to me that had done that. And so I basically, asked her, how did you do it? Where did you start? She said, I started with a proposal. Let me see your proposal. What does that look like? And I just copied what she did in terms of the process. And there's a story in the defining decade about the box of books and the connection there that I was So by this time I was out of graduate school, and I had thought about writing a 20-something book because I was working with a lot of young adults and realizing, like, this is my space and nobody's doing this. There are no books on this. And so I was teaching a class. This is just after I'd graduated from Berkeley. I was teaching classes there, and I was ordering books from a publisher in New York to textbooks just to look at. And long story short, she said, I got some in the mail, like this big box of books showed up, but it wasn't what I'd ordered. It was a bunch of other kinds of books. And I thought, like, oh, shoot, well, that's weird. So I emailed the editor, on the box there and said, "Oh, I ordered this, I got that. Sorry." We had a brief email exchange about, "Oh, how do you choose books for your classes?" It was just a nice back and forth. The end. Then about a year or two later, after looking at my friend's proposal and how she'd gotten her book going, I'd written a proposal and I thought, well, I have a proposal, but I have nothing to do with it. I don't have a single connection in New York, no publishing connections. I don't even know where you would start. And then, of course, it dawned on me that actually there was that one person in publishing that I exchanged emails with. So I sent her an email and I said, "You probably hate it when people do this, but I have this proposal. I was wondering if you would just take a peek at it and suggest, what I might do next." And she looked at it and was like, "Oh man, you've got something." And then boom, 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 here's the defining decade. So it's a great example of, kind of seeing people who are adjacent to you, who are near to you. You see like they did it, and then you have sort of the courage to ask them, "Well, how'd you do it? And then could you help me do it?" I think that is, sometimes takes a bit of nerve.
I love that simulacrum of the strength of weak ties. One of my favorite chapters in your
Mhm.
book. Some 20 somethings who might be tuning into this podcast might have that inertia of someone like me doesn't do that, and they might not actually have that one person adjacent to them that could help them, or they could lean on their story to help them. If someone is in that area of limbo or inertia and don't have any role models in the space, how do they overcome that feeling of that feeling that they can't do what they kind of dream to do if they don't have any role models in that space?
Yeah, well, I mean, to kind of talk about that, you reference the strength of weak ties. Like, what is that? It's a concept, not my concept. It's 30-year-old research out of Stanford at this point. Mark Granovetter, he looked at when people get new jobs or new apartments or new books or new anything, that kind of that new information, that new idea, that new connection, that new lead almost always comes from outside the inner circle. It comes from weak ties. And so weak ties are friends of friends of friends of friends, or our neighbors, bosses, cousin. And so I guess I would encourage people to imagine, and that is one area where I felt like the defining decade can help people from a variety of different backgrounds to realize you may be 4 degrees removed from somebody who's done that thing, but that's a weak tie. That reaching out to those people and saying, "My cousin worked for you a few years ago. Would you mind if I asked you X? Or might you have an opening at Y?" That is actually how new things happen. And so I think just normalizing that and helping young adults realize it's not nepotism. It's not getting things you don't deserve because you're well connected. It's actually kind of the opposite of that. It's helping people get things they do deserve because they're just able to get the information or get the spark or get the idea. So I guess I would say not to assume that just because somebody right adjacent, a neighbor or a parent or a best friend hasn't done it, it doesn't mean that nobody in your whole weak tie network can help you. Somebody can.
100%, Meg. I absolutely love this advice. It's probably my favorite chapter in your book because it's allowed me to strategize this podcast, but also post rationalize a lot of my own life because my entire story is predicated on getting hands up, not hands out by other people.
Yeah,
And
nice.
and one thing that I've learned from this chapter is that transparency is paramount. Like sharing to people. Sorry. So what I took from your book is a concept that I create called one true connection, or creating one true connection. And
Mm,
what I define as a true connection with someone is just picking one person and exposing your highlights, your lowlights, your desired outcomes. And if you share that with one person, they either relate to a lot of that and can
mhm.
provide value to you based on one of those facets, or they might just know someone else that does, and they
Right.
connect you with them. And that over time has a compound interest network effect, like a spider. Imagine a
Right.
spider, kind of spider web to the listeners. And people look at this podcast and think, well, you've got Meg Jay on, you must be best friends with her. But I just reached out to you Like
You just sent me an email. It was
when
very compelling.
I
Yeah,
just
the power of a good email.
Oh,
Mhm.
100%. And
Mhm.
all my previous, like, I started off by interviewing my best friends and one mentor, and that's had a spider web effect. They have connected me with an individual. So by having one guest on, I perhaps have 1.8 guests because this whole
Right.
infrastructure is predicated on referrals. So
Yes.
perhaps a task, maybe one the
Everything is. Yeah.
100%. Perhaps the
Mhm.
listeners can just note down some of the figures in their life, these kind of weak ties, and understand who else they're connected to, and maybe even jot that down,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
maybe disseminate some of that information and start doing the cold called emails or
Yeah.
text messages or whatever else.
I mean, that is often at this point, a lot of what I do is that people will come to me, and I mean people, random people who email me or students of mine or people who know me in town, and they'll say, "Oh, can you help me with X, Y, or Z?" And I'll listen and hear what it is. And I'll say, I can't, but I have a student who just got a job in that space in LA. You need to talk to him. And then I put those people in touch. I mean, I think I've done that like 5 times this month of, people coming to me and imagining I have a crystal ball, which I totally do not have. But I do know a lot of people at this point who've done a lot of things, especially as 20 somethings. And so it's exactly what you're saying. You've got to just be willing to get out there and talk to people and tell them what you want and what you're trying to do. And I think that like I said, it takes a lot of nerve, takes a lot of courage. But there's no other way for people to find out what it is you're trying to do or what you're trying to get.
I said this was going to be the last question about you, but I just want to ask one
Sure.
quick further question on you, Dr. Meg. You speak about how when you were in your 20s or when you were starting to write your book, you thought, well, someone like me doesn't write a book. Do you
Hmm.
now that you go into some of these podcasts, some of these talk shows, TED Talks, some of the biggest stages in the world to deliver your message, do you ever still feel like that? Like Meg from um your
South
hometown?
Carolina. Yeah, yeah. I definitely did in this process. I think, I was thinking I'm working on another book right now, and I was thinking about finding a way in that book to talk about, and I'd like to hear from other people about this too, how relatively recently it's been where in general I'm like, oh no, I got this. That's been, I think that people don't really feel like that. It's sort of, like another thing I talk about in the book, kind of the 10,000 hours. I mean, you got to do something. You got to really work hard at something for a good 5, 10, 15 years before you're like, I have got this in every circumstance. So I definitely did not feel that when I first wrote the book. As a matter of fact, if you had allowed me in the first year that the book was out to roll back the clock and throw it in the trash, I would have done that.
No.
100%. Yep. Because like all other humans or most other humans, all I could think about was what, oh shoot, maybe I should have done this, or, this, when the book first came out, it got a lot of press. It was actually quite controversial. And when something first comes out, you hear a lot about from people who love it, you hear a lot from people who don't love it. And so I think I was, confused about whether or not this was a good thing, that I had done a good thing. Like I was trying to help people. And so it was sort of like, well, have I done that? Have I mostly helped people, or have I just pissed people off? And so I was sort of, the jury was still out on that. Now, 10 years later, I just wrote the update, which came out in the US in 2021. I think the UK has the updated version now. But anyway, now I've editing it, revising it for the update was really fun because I felt like, okay, I feel, really good about this project. It's done. Definitely the good has outweighed the bad. But it was interesting looking back. I remembered that first year. I thought, man, I wish I'd never done this. And definitely when I gave the TED talk, I had been teaching, for quite some time before that. So I was used to getting up in front of audiences and rambling on. But that is not the same as giving a TED talk where you have 14 minutes and a clock counting down in your face and you're an audience of 3,000 and like Bono is the audience, so that was not my normal talk. So that was the most stressful talk I've ever given, and I definitely felt like, what the heck, and again, that just went crazy, and got 10 million views, and I got 5 million emails, people saying you've changed my life, and 5 million emails, people saying you're the devil. So you just kind of have to absorb all that, and then big picture, now I realize, yeah, okay, this has been far more good than not good. And I do feel like I'm writing another book right now, and I'm like, oh yeah, I got this. Now that doesn't mean it'll be, do everything that I want it to do perfectly, and you can't control the environment and what the conversations and what's happening in the ether when it comes out. Doesn't mean it'll be necessarily a bestseller, but I definitely feel like this time, oh yeah, I know I got this. I know what I'm doing, and that is a nice feeling.
Yeah, exactly. It'll still be hard work, but the tools will feel light in your hands, I guess.
Yes, yes, very nicely said. So it's like I'm enjoying it, and I feel like I know how to do it. I know what I want to do, and I also know enough to know I can't control, like if politics blows up in the year that my book comes out, that's all anybody wants to talk about, and that may not be like the book that I wrote. So, you just kind of can't control all aspects of the world when you put your project out.
Well, I'm sure the listeners can't wait for it already, and I'm sure maybe we'll have you back on to talk about that book
Yeah, well,
when
I
it's.
hope you do. Yeah.
So I want to demystify one of the terms that I love in your book, or one of the kind of concepts in your book, where you say that most consequential moments in one's autobiography happens in your 20s. Why is this, and what kind of moments are we talking about?
Yeah, so this is a cool kind of study, some data. It was out of University of Michigan, Boston University. And it was a really cool study where researchers looked at the life stories of, sort of successful people. And what they saw was that, I'm not remembering exactly, 75%, 80% of sort of life's most consequential moments happen before age 35. And so what that means is that the decisions we make, the moves, like the geographical or career moves we make, the jobs we take, the relationships we have, the changes we make, that the most significant ones that have the biggest impact on how our lives unfold, most of those happen by around age 35. And when you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, this is why I work in this age group, is because this is where all the action is. That if I work with 20 somethings, I'm getting in on, or I'm getting in front of life's kind of most consequential decisions. The other cool part about that study that I really liked was that what the researchers found was that people said that they didn't realize how consequential the choices and the moves and the relationships and the relocations and whatever, they didn't realize how consequential it was at the time. So sometimes it's like you're saying, that person you meet, that job, you're like, oh well, I don't know, I'll give it a try, or this move that you make, or this conference you go to and learn something new, you don't realize how important it is to how your life story unfolds. But it's, that is where the action is happening. That sort of early adulthood, 20 something stuff is actually what's laying the foundation, whether you know it or not.
What are some of these consequential moments? What are some prime examples?
I mean, some of them are, would be pretty obvious in terms of the jobs you take, the relationships you have, the cross country moves, or even the trips you do, that where you learn something, or you're inspired, or you see the world a different way. Some of the things may not seem that consequential at the time, like you were saying. You may talk to someone on this podcast, you may have a lovely conversation, and that may be the end of that. But 5 years from now, that conversation could end up being really important. And so I think, in your 20s is when a lot of this kind of exploration and the learning we were talking about is happening. And that's why a lot of these sort of moves and decisions and choices end up being so impactful.
I feel like as a mid 20 something year old myself, I'm too busy trying to improve my life that I forget to actually depict what's happened before me. And there's a really great Socrates quote that you quote in your book, saying um, is it like the unexamined life. What is the quote again? I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, well, it's the reverse. So the famous one is, let's see, the the unexamined life isn't worth living. But the flip of that, there was an American psychologist, Sheldon Cobb, many decades ago. He said, "Well, yeah, but the unlived life isn't worth examining." The point being, like, don't come in therapy and like talk forever about your life. Go out there and live it and see what happens. That I am a firm believer that people aren't going to change or improve or grow or get what they want by showing up to my office 5 times a week. That it's going to be by getting out and getting the new job and seeing what happens, or trying to have a healthier relationship and seeing what happens, or moving across the country and seeing what happens. That's where the real growth comes from, not from people, not from sitting in my office.
From the outside in, I'm guessing, like, for example, my dad would say the 20s are such an easy period of time to live. Like, I thought it would be a time where it'd be stress free, laissez faire, but your book with the case studies prove otherwise. 20 somethings are feeling paralyzed and anxious and uncertain. Why is being 20 so damn hard?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm still kind of amazed that people actually still think they're fun. I thought that we had fully discussed that. I mean, they are fun, but so were all the other decades, which is good news for y'all. It's life continues to be fun, but empirically speaking, your 20s are your mental health low point. I mean, that's what my next book is about, very explicitly: young adult mental health, which is implied in the defining decade, but I don't really get specifically into it. But it's because so much is uncertain in your 20s that people don't have the things that make them happy. They don't have the things that make them healthy and sort of mentally feeling like mentally well. So they don't have job stability, they don't have relationship stability, they don't have friendship stability, they can't pay their bills, they don't know where they're going to live in 2 or 3 years. So that kind of uncertainty makes people unhappy. The brain really doesn't like uncertainty. So by far your 20s are the most uncertain decade of life, which is what, for 2 reasons why I work in that space. One is because they're so uncertain. If I work there, I get to help kind of get in front of all those decisions that are about to be made, and all those choices and jobs and relationships that people are putting together. Also because of all that uncertainty, they're really hard. The brain hates that. It hates all the uncertainty and the transitions and the changes and learning so many new things at once. So 20 somethings, arguably may be at their peak physical. So where I was ending with that is, because of all that uncertainty and transition and all the new things you're learning to do, empirically speaking, these are not the happiest, best years of your life. And I actually tell 20 somethings, if your 20s turn out to be the best years of your life, something has gone terribly wrong, right? Because, like, don't you want your 30s to be great, your 40s to be great, and your 50s to be great? Like, you don't want this to be the best time of your life, right?
100%. There's an example that you use, or a metaphor you use, saying that not making a choice is like floating in a body of water and expecting someone to come and rescue you. How
Mm-hmm.
how do you get out of a body of water like that, metaphorically?
Yeah, that was a metaphor that one of my clients used. That is one of the most quoted or mentioned things from the book. People will email me and say, that is how I feel, that ocean metaphor. So this is, yeah, I mean, everything I know practically, I know from listening to my clients. They're very smart and tell me a lot about what's happening in their lives. But, one of them said, being in my 20s is like being in the middle of the ocean and I don't know which way to swim. I can't see anything in any direction. So in that session, we talked about like, well, shoot, if that's the deal, what do you do? And he was like, well, I don't know. I guess you just like float along and hope somebody comes and picks you up. And I'm thinking about this in the middle of the ocean, like that is about it, right? I mean, maybe you could like start paddling in one direction, but you probably wouldn't make it somewhere before you die. So I end up with him kind of saying, I don't think that's actually the right metaphor. Like, I think you think you're in the middle of the ocean with no way to swim. But if you think about that, like that's really probably not accurate. So, I mean, that metaphor sort of suggests that every direction is exactly the same and you can't see anything as far as you look in any direction. And that's usually not true. Usually if I work with a student or a client, like we can, you can help them kind of know what they don't realize they know of, well, what have you done before that you liked, or what are the hopes or dreams that you might like to try, and what's a direction you could go, and where do you think maybe you do see land, and to try to help them realize there is something you can do besides just sort of tread water and hope somebody picks you up and takes you to land, but to realize you know something, you probably know more than you think you do, and if you don't know it, who would? It's your life, right?
Exactly, Meg. I love that. I understand why that was one of the most highlighted and called out segments of your book. I also want to talk about the effects of social media on the expectations of a 20-something-year-old. How detrimental has social media been in terms of the symptoms that you see from your clients?
Yeah, that was interesting because when I wrote The Defining Decade, it first came out in 2012. So back then, Facebook was like barely a thing, and it was the only thing. There were no other things. There was no Instagram, no TikTok, no nothing. It was just really Facebook. It was barely a thing. And so it was interesting because I was already specializing in 20 somethings, already had all day, every day. They're like coming in my door telling me about their lives. And suddenly they start coming in and saying, oh, I think I'm going to join this thing called Facebook, of which of course I'd heard of, but hadn't joined myself. And then they would come in a week or two later and they're like, oh my God, I'm on Facebook and I hate it. And this person's life and that person's life. And I feel so bad about where I am. And everybody's so happy and everybody's getting married and everybody's getting a promotion. So I saw all that unfold in real time, like, at the beginning. What was interesting when I went to write that chapter in the book, which was My Life Should Look Better on Facebook, was the title of the chapter. There was very little data to scrape together to support what I was talking about because it was so new. There were, virtually no studies had been done yet. It takes time to like collect data and get the papers out in peer-reviewed journals, blah, blah. So that was interesting that what I saw anecdotally had not yet kind of come up much in the research. But by the time I wrote the update in 2021, obviously, there's plenty of data out there to say that, the more social media you use, especially if you use it passively, like you're like scrolling and surveilling and comparing rather than like actually connecting, probably the less happy with your life you're going to be. I mean, I'm pretty clear in the update of the Defining Decade. I talk a lot more about social media in the update. The new chapter is called My Life Should Look Better on Instagram. Although, as I said, by the time this comes to print, it'll be something else, which of course it's TikTok now. But it's all the same. Like, I hate to break it to the TikTokers out there. This is just Facebook of, 2022 or 2023. I mean, like it's a similar kind of, we're going to get on there and we're going to, put all this out, and it's going to have different effects on different people. But I think I say it's kind of like living together. I'm not for it. I'm not against it. It's not whether you do it, it's probably how you do it. And so I have plenty of people who feel like, I use social media in a healthy way, or it helps me connect with people, or, that's how I get my message out there about my podcast. And, and then there are other people that say every time I go on Instagram, I feel like hell and I drink half a bottle of wine and do a bunch of online shopping. So like, that's probably not the way. So I think it's not whether, it's how. But that takes a lot of self-awareness and some self-discipline to figure out like how are you going to use it.
100%, Meg. One thing that I have is like a mindfulness lag or a mindfulness technique where when I'm on social media, my subconscious or my psyche tells me two words or three words: intent or distract. And that's just a
Mm,
reminder to me, am I doing this with intent to find
nice.
something at the other side, whether it's a piece
Yep.
of inspiration, a piece of motivation, some content from my podcast, or even some sort of entertainment for myself to maybe lighten the
Yeah.
mood? Or am I
Mm,
doing it to distract myself because my reality is actually unbearable, so I need quick dopamine to distract myself?
mhm.
It, and when I ask myself that question and the answer is distract, it allows me to then think, what stones do I need to unturn to see
Mhm.
what
Nice.
changes I need to make? And
Mhm.
instead of going on social media to distract myself, I then understand the root cause for the distraction and then try and go back onto the internet to find perhaps resolutions to some of the problems that I need to sort. And, and,
Nicely
and
said. Nicely done. Yeah.
and one thing that I wanted to highlight, like even though Facebook and these technologies are novel and accelerating and perhaps on steroids, we've had a version of this for many years. We've had magazines and radio
Right.
stations and television where life looked perfect from the outside
Right.
in
Yep.
anyway. So this is obviously not novel
Right.
information. It's just been accelerated and put on
It's just,
steroids.
yeah. I actually love that you picked that up because I am frankly shocked at how rarely people compare or make the connection between, you know, the magazine. Like I grew up in like, the 80s, 90s, and had to learn like don't flip through Cosmopolitan for 2 hours every night or you're going to feel like hell about yourself. That was something that, like, young women especially were taught, like, this isn't real life. These aren't real people. These photos aren't real. And but it's the same. It's just now more, and it's kind of more hitting both men and women, and of course it's like on your phone, which is right there all the time. So it's kind of a lot more to manage. You used to just be able to be like, well, I choose not to buy, Cosmo or Vogue or whatever. It's a lot harder for a young person to say, well, I'm not going to be on social media. So it requires much more self-discipline, but you're right, it is the same process.
100%. And we don't get to see the harsh realities of some of these influencers online, but we see our failures from a front row seat.
Right.
And we need to remember they're human too. They go to they have days they can't get up and they cry in bed, or they snooze their alarm clock, or they have a heartbreak and they're eating Haagen-Dazs at night. But we don't get to see
Right.
that. But we get to see our own failures and from a front row seat. And we need to just remember that they have very similar symptoms and very similar days too. And I think
Yeah.
having that
Yeah.
mindfulness is very important. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a saying that's in, it must be in the defining decade somewhere, but that I, think about or tell people a lot. And that's just compare and despair, that we almost always compare ourselves to something bigger, something better, whether it's, how we look or how our podcast is doing or how our book is doing. But, comparisons, I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, are, I mean, they can be not helpful or worthless. Sometimes they can be like, oh, I want that. Like that makes me feel like I want to get out there and work for something. But we have to figure out like, how am I using that to motivate myself or just to feel bad?
And I can't remember a single time where I've compared someone that's not doing as well as me. I've always compared to people that are doing more than me. I've never
Mm-hmm.
compared down the way,
The
and that
downward, yeah. I know. Well, here's the funny thing is that when people do that, when they do that, they're like, oh well, yeah, but that comparison doesn't count because like they explain that one away, like, oh well, I asked a client who said, like what you're saying, he was saying everybody else's life looks so much better, blah blah blah, whatever. And I said, well, what about, I mentioned, some other situations he might see driving to work every day or living his life. He's like, well, yeah, but I mean, obviously that's not. And I'm like, well, you're just leaving that out. I mean, you're, instead of realizing that there are good things happening in your life and you've, been fortunate in a lot of ways and done some good things, but that just is kind of, it's like when you get a compliment, you're like, oh, pff, you're just being nice, or I got lucky. Whereas when someone criticizes us, it feels like, the sort of word of God.
100%, Meg. One thing that I've made a conscious effort to do is, instead of comparing myself peer to peer, shoulder to shoulder with someone, for example, a work colleague who may have got a promotion at the same age as me, despite perhaps they went to private school, perhaps they had a different mentor, perhaps they've got different
Right.
working life balance, they've got other caring responsibilities than I do. Comparing shoulder to shoulder is not very useful. So one thing that I've started to do is actually compare to the only healthy comparison is to previous versions of yourself, so you can see
Right.
the
Yeah.
marginal gain that you've made. And for me, that's been such a great tool to do. It's
Yeah,
just
absolutely. And it's, I think, also realizing that you can't compare two lives. There are just too many variables, like it's never a fair comparison. Like you're saying, the only helpful, really relevant comparison is where you used to be and where you are now, or where you are now and sort of where you're trying to get. And it's like, it's really got to be sort of your vertical path rather than sideways.
Meg, I want to talk about love, because there's a really great line in your book that says happiness is more about who you marry and not what college you attend. Why is that? Why is marriage so important?
Well, I mean, and I say marriage, I mean that broadly, partnership, love. I mean, that relationships end up sort of being more important in terms of our happiness and health than our jobs. Um, One of the reasons is that we're going to change our jobs a lot in our lifetime. So your average 20 something will have 5 jobs by the age of 30. And that's sort of a normal kind of, ideally an upward progression of jobs and responsibilities. Most young people I work with honestly are like, yeah, I would kind of like to find somebody and settle down and, have a partner and not have 5 relationships by the time I'm 30 and then 5 more before I'm 40. Most people are sort of looking for love. Um, so, it ends up being a really big decision who it is you sort of intertwine your life with. It has a lot of ramifications for what life is like when you come home and your finances and whether you can move here, move there. So, it just ends up kind of impacting your life usually in more ways and emotionally than work. Like if you don't, most of my clients are smart, interesting people. They can figure out the work thing with some decent guidance, and just kind of keep on improving that. Love is a bit messier and it's more emotional. So it make, in terms of, there's tons of research that shows that, one of the biggest predictors of health and happiness across the lifespan is the quality of your relationships. And so maybe that's for you, that's marriage, maybe it's partnership, maybe it's best friend, or maybe it's, having a dog. I don't know, but it tends to be like, what are the relationships in my life, and what is the quality there that ends up having a bigger impact on your health and happiness than your job.
There's an amazing case study that you use on your client Alex, or under the pseudonym Alex. And there's a line that says the best time to work on Alex's marriage is before she has one.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, this was a good piece of, this is one of the things I learned when I was in my 20s, and I said I was on my big learning tour. So I was in grad school. Alex was one of my first clients, and she was a 20 something, and I was just barely older than her. I might have been 30, but I remember thinking, oh, this I've got, right? Like anything else, I know nothing about. 20 somethings I can do. How wrong I was, because she comes in and was talking about this hookup and that and whatever. And I was sort of like, whatever, back, thinking she's just being a 20 something. She's just goofing around, sleeping around. Like, what difference does it make? So my supervisor pushed me to kind of, challenge her a bit on some of the choices she was making and whether they were making her happy or whether she was sort of, kind of valuing herself enough. And so anyway, I pushed back on that, and I was like, well, okay, she's sleeping with a knucklehead, but it's not like she's going to marry the guy. And then my supervisor said, well, not yet, but she might marry the next one. And then she said, the best time to work on your marriage is before you have one. And that, to me, sums up not just the love piece, but really why I do all the work I do with 20 somethings is that I get to work on careers before people have them. I get to work on marriages before people have them. I get to work on lives before people have them. That really kind of the best time to work on anything. The best time to get a prenup is before you need one, right? The best time to, have end of life directive is before you need one. Like, it's always the best time to work on something. So, it's that kind of spoke to me more broadly, but I think it's especially true with relationships in ways that 20 somethings don't recognize. Like, everybody knows jobs matter and you got to be able to pay the bills, but the relationship thing can feel a little bit like, oh, whatever, it doesn't matter, I'm just having a good time, and who I date doesn't matter. But then somewhere around this age of like 28 to 32, suddenly all those clients who told me doesn't matter, doesn't matter, doesn't matter, suddenly are like, I'm going to get married. And then there was never any space to like work on that of, well, I thought who you date doesn't matter. And now you're going to go make the biggest decision of your life, not having thought much about what kind of person you might want to be with or what kind of relationship you might like. So that's kind of a problem. So I kind of try to get people to think about like, okay, well, you don't want to settle down right now. That's actually awesome, because what that means is you can practice and you can have relationships, and it's like jobs. Go out there and try jobs, see what you like and what you don't like, see what you're good at, what you're not good at. Like, that's the only way to get better. It's not to like, blow off your career for 10 years and then suddenly you think you're going to drop into, being really good at something. It's not going to happen.
Oh, I love that advice. I remember I did a solo podcast, Meg, and one of the amazing questions that came through was, what is one thing in your 20s that you would regret in your 30s? And mine was to not date around enough and with intent. And one of the listeners of the podcast, who is a kind of 40-something-year-old mother, sent me some amazing feedback on it. She was heckling, laughing at it. She was like, David, I can't believe you want to, both you want to date around, but you also want your partner to date around equally. And I'm like, yeah, of course I do. I want to have experienced all different nationalities, values, backgrounds, ages, careers, ethos. And I want my potential partner, my 30 somethings, to do the exact same. So we've made a calculated decision. We've built our own identity capital. We've experienced so many other people's identity capital. And we've made an informed decision based on prior events to get me there. And not only that, I had a wonderful author called Logan Ury on the podcast. She is the author of How Not to Die Alone.
Oh
And
yeah, I've heard of that book. Yep.
yeah, she's brilliant. She brought to life this concept of the secretary problem, and it's basically a kind of case study around recruitment into a secretarial role, where it's a hypothetical situation where if you were to interview 100 secretaries, and once you say no to one or yes to one, you can't go back on your decision. When would be the most optimal point within that 100 interviews to make a decision and stick with it? And statistically, it's around something like 33, because that sample of 33 will be representative of the rest. And then she translates that into dating, where so many people have sunk cost fallacy, where they don't want to commit to a relationship just in case the love of their life is still out there roaming.
Something better.
Something better is out there. Exactly. And she said, hypothetically, usually people date between the ages of 20 and 40. So the prime time within that period to pick and choose a potential partner is at age 26. Hypothetically, you should have experienced such a wide array of people at that point. You have enough feedback or enough information to make a decision. And she says the technique that you use once you get to the age of 26 is you look back and think of the best person that you dated, and the next person that comes along that meets that spec or exceeds it, that's the one. What's your opinion on that?
She's saying people do that, or they should do that?
They should do that.
They should do that. In theory, that isn't a bad strategy, although the problem with the theory is that they're assuming in the secretary example or in the dating example that the first third is representative, is a wide swath, where unfortunately for my clients who are not being intentional about their dating, they date the same kind of poorly matched person over and over and over again for the first 5 years of their 20s until they finally get it through their thick skulls that this is not the type, that something needs to change, or they date the same person that's totally not working, you know? So in theory, I agree with, like, yeah, I think once you've dated, you know, a certain representative sample, you probably have a good sense, and then kind of choosing someone who fits what you're looking for. I mean, it's called like satisficing versus maximizing. You know, find someone who fits what you want versus like go out there and look for the best person and like you'll never find them. But I do tend to find that, you know, late 20s is when people often shift from like, oh, it doesn't matter, to like, oh, shoot, this matters. Which isn't a bad time to make that shift, but you kind of want to sort of feel like, okay, in my early 20s or mid 20s, ideally, I was out there intentionally trying out different things versus like, well, I was unintentionally just dating the same kind of person over and over again. And then the next person I met who wasn't that person, then that they're the one. Do you know what I'm saying?
100%. Totally aligned with that. I don't quite want to ask you what are green flags for a 20-something-year-old to look for in a potential partner, but potentially asking you, what are some from the experience that you've had with 20-somethings, what are some red flags to avoid in terms of potential partners in your 20s?
Um, you know what? I don't have specific ones, but there's a quote that I love that one of my clients told me, which of course she got off of like Twitter, Lord knows what meme she sent me, but it's something like, when you're wearing rose-colored glasses, red flags just look like flags. And so I do find that a lot of my clients are, you know, they're like, want it to work. This could be the one, you know, like that. They're always like trying to make it work, trying to make it fit. And they don't want to see the red flags, that they're there and they know they're there, but they're like, oh, but it's fine because of blah, blah. That they've got on like the rose colored glasses and they don't want to see the red flags. David, I'll tell you, I have to sign off because I have a 3 o'clock client calling me.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. But did you want a quick wrap up, or are you going to edit your magic from here?
Let's do a quick wrap up.
Okay.
Meg, I won't keep you for much longer. I've had such a wonderful conversation with you across identity capital, connections, love, and your own story, which I'm so glad and proud that you shared so openly on the podcast. If someone wants to connect with you, your work online, or even buy your book, where's the best place to find you?
The book is everywhere, should be everywhere, you know, bookstore near you, independent bookstores, Amazon, everywhere. You can find more about my work on my website, megjay.com. I am really not on social media, much to my publicist's chagrin, but you know, people can find me out there if they're looking for me. So thank you, David. I'm so impressed with what you're doing, and you definitely have a weak tie for life.
Oh, well, I can't wait to use it. I'm going to read your other book, Supernormal, so can't wait to
Oh,
send you
yes,
feedback on that.
you must. Let me know after you're done with it, because we'll talk again.
Let's do that. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right. Bye, David.